So welcome all to our last virtual speaker series session before our summer break. My name is Christoph Lüdke and I'm a professor of business ethics at the Technical University of Munich and the director of the Institute for Ethics in Artificial Intelligence. With our speaker series, the TUM Institute for Ethics in AI invites experts from all over the world to talk about ethics and governance of AI. These events serve as an important platform for sharing new research and exchanging knowledge. Since our launch in 2019, we were already able to run 24 speaker series events. And we are looking forward to hearing from you today during our discussion. Today, we are delighted to have with us David Barnes, retired Brigadier General of the US Army. He is here to talk about, we are the, I'm not sure if I can pronounce that correctly, LIMFAC, okay, some thoughts on military AI. So let me say a few more words about our distinguished guest speaker. David Barnes graduated from the United States Military Academy with a Bachelor of Science in Aeromechanical Engineering. He holds an MA in philosophy from the University of Massachusetts as Amherst and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Colorado Boulder. So almost the same degrees that I am. His research interests include normative and applied ethics, especially the ethics of war and emerging technology. He's a member of the editorial boards for AI and Ethics and the Journal of Military Ethics, and he serves on the board of directors for the International Society for Military Ethics. He's also the author of The Ethics of Military Privatization, the US Armed Contractor Phenomenon, and multiple articles on ethics of armed conflicts and the ethics of emerging technologies. And recently, he was named as one of Forbes' top 15 AI ethicists. Congratulations to that. Dave Barnes advises senior government and business leaders on mitigating AI regulatory and ethical risks affecting their business or investment decisions. He retired from the US Army after nearly 32 years of distinguished service, most recently serving as professor at the United States Military Academy, PUSMA, Department of English and Philosophy, West Point, New York, and as Chief AI Ethics Officer for the US Army's AI Integration Center. As Chief AI Ethics Officer, he advises the Army on incorporating ethics, law, and policy into Army AI design, development, testing, and employment, directly contributing to the development of the DoD AI ethical principles and the 2020 US Army AI strategy. His remarks are personal views and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Defense, the US Army, the US Military Academy, or any other department or agency of the US government. So, and before we begin, I would like to ask you all to turn off your microphone and camera during the session and submit your questions via chat or raise your hand. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Also, let us know if you're experiencing technical difficulties in the chat, and I give the floor now to our distinguished guest speaker.
Well, thank you so much for that very wonderful introduction, very glowing. I very much appreciate it. I'd like to thank the Institute and colleagues there for allowing me to come and speak. It is quite an honor to be here with you today. And, you know, as Professor noted, the disclaimer, these are my personal views. And the reason they are my personal views are and I hope that this presentation and discussion today will be a part of that expanding meaningful dialogue. So today I want to focus on 4 areas. First, I'm going to introduce this concept of a LIMFAC. Yes, it's one of those sorts of strange terms. Then I'm going to discuss how military artificial intelligence is more than just lethal autonomy. Of course, any talk about military and AI cannot escape what I like to call the shiny object, and that is lethal autonomy. And so I'll spend a little time talking about that, as well as the AI risks and challenges that are focused on military's development and use of AI, but really are critical in thinking about in terms of how we look at adopting AI across our society at large. So let's start, of course, with a quote. So in The Art of War, Sun Tzu claimed that if you know your enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer defeat. But who is Sun Tzu speaking of? Who's he's talking about the commander, a person. And so AI may be changing the character of war, but the nature of war is immutable. War, even fought with the most technological weapons and tools, remains and will remain a human endeavor. According to the US Army doctrine, war is chaotic, lethal, a fundamentally human endeavor. It is a clash of wills fought among and between people. All war is inherently about changing human behavior, with each side trying to alter the behavior of the other by force of arms. Success requires the opportunity to outthink an opponent and exploit the opportunities that come from positions of relative advantage. The side that best understands the operational environment, adapts more rapidly, decides to act more quickly in conditions of uncertainty, is the one most likely to win. And like any human endeavor, we are the LIMFAC. So those of you who have worked with the military know that we are fans of acronyms. We love taking different words and putting them together and inventing new words. Well, one of them, and it's actually a little bit older, is LIMFAC, which stands for limiting factors. So from a military standpoint, limiting factors, we have to consider what are the things that are going to limit our planning? What are the limiting factors in terms of conducting operations? Now, it's my belief that when it comes to AI and AI ethics, we are the LIMFAC. And what I mean is that a lot of the focus in the news has been on the technological failures of AI, such as the autonomous vehicle that makes an error and runs a stop sign. But the reality is, it's really about the people. People are the ones developing, deploying, using this technology in the world today, and will so in the future. And each of our decisions, regardless of where we sit on an AI system's lifecycle, matter. So even consider the data scientist. When she's optimizing code, she's bringing her particular worldview, whether it's conscious or not, into her code optimization's decisions. In a sense, she's making values-laden decisions that can affect the downstream in the developmental process in ways that may not realize until the system is actually fielded. So when we think of an AI system, we have to think of it more than just the data, the algorithm, the computing power, right? The classical three-legged stool. We, people, are part of the AI team. And AI is becoming ubiquitous, right? So when we think about it in terms of the aspects of how it's affecting society, we also have to appreciate that in terms of military development and use of AI, it's affecting all aspects of it, not just on how the military plans on using artificial intelligence enabled systems on the battlefield, but we have to think about it, how it's impacting the whole of enterprise. So back to Sun Tzu. When we think about military use of artificial intelligence, we have to think about how we might be able to leverage this new technology so that we can allow the unit, the commander, to better know itself, better know the enemy, to better plan, prepare, and execute its mission. But the thing to remember, and something that I truly believe, is that AI can empower soldiers to navigate uncertain, complex battlefields, precisely deliver synchronized effects, and decisively accomplish the mission while enhancing combatant discrimination and lowering the risk of deployed forces. So today, when I talk about military AI, I'm going to give a US Army perspective because, again, that's where my roots are. And one framework which I'm going to introduce today as part of this discussion is this conception of warfighter functions. So warfighter functions, and there are 6 of them. The purpose is to provide an intellectual organization for common critical capabilities available to commanders and staffs at all echelons and levels of warfare. And commanders that integrate and synchronize these capabilities with other warfighting functions to accomplish the objectives of the mission. And the warfighter functions are as follows: command and control, movement and maneuver, intelligence, fires, sustainment, and protection. And I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into each of these to talk about what the purpose of the warfighting function is, but also where we might see advancement and considerations for where AI-enabled systems might help increase the efficiency and effectiveness in each of these areas. So the first one I want to talk about is sustainment. It may seem strange, I'm an old armor officer talking about sustainment, but logistics are the key to providing sustained operations. And the sustainment warfighter function is designed to look at the tasks and systems to provide the support and services to ensure freedom of action, extending operational reach, and to prolong endurance of the deployed forces, right? And sustainment operations are throughout, from back, for example, in the United States, into theater, into a combat zone. And when we think about sustainment, we have to think about multiple areas. It includes, of course, logistics, right? The food, the fuel, the ammunition, the spare parts, the end equipment, but it's also financial management, personal services, and health service support. And so when we think about ways that the military is considering employing artificial intelligence, one of the areas is providing a sustainment common operating picture. Does the commander know the current status of all of the sustainment support that they have available to her at the time? Are they able to forecast and predict the next steps to pre-position supplies, right? So we're looking at things like autonomous ground resupply. Another project that we worked on in the Artificial Intelligence Integration Center is predictive maintenance. And you think about how expensive it is to replace parts, even through the normal training cycle. Well, can we leverage artificial intelligence, we asked ourselves, to help identify when critical components of vehicles, like helicopters, for example, are going to fail, and so that we can prepare and replace them in a timely but cost-effective manner. It has the potential to save millions of dollars. But also think about on the other side of it, health service support. In terms of the battlefield, we have the golden hour. We have to look at evacuation. Can we do that in a more streamlined and efficient way? How do we triage our casualties? How do we triage the casualties of civilians that are caught in the crossfire? Can we leverage these benefits of artificial intelligence and the vast amount of data that can be collected to help improve some of those things? Well, the next warfighter function I want to talk about is protection, right? The idea of this warfighter function is to synchronize and integrate all protection capabilities to safeguard bases, secure routes, protect the forces. Now, this includes protecting personnel, protecting our partners, protecting host nations, protecting assets. And the idea is you want to allow and enable the commander to maintain the force integrity, the combat power. And protection is a wide umbrella. Protection includes things like survivability operations, to be able to provide health protection for the forces. Things like conducting chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear support. Can we identify where potential threats are, or if there is incidents that are there on the battlefield, can we isolate them and contain them? Explosive ordnance, air and missile defense, personnel recovery if we were to lose a downed pilot, risk management. But it also includes other areas too, performing cyberspace security and defense. And we've seen in other discussions through the Institute where AI is leveraged in cyberspace in order to protect critical systems, but also we've begun to really appreciate how those systems are vulnerable. And so when you think about artificial intelligence in the function area of protection, one of the first things that may come to mind is adversarial AI, which I'll talk about later. But our systems are going to be vulnerable, AI systems, to an adversary's AI, right? And how an adversary can manipulate the data or the model itself can affect overall the system's integrity. I already mentioned cyberspace security and defense, but think about just the importance of having assured positioning, navigation, and timing, right? There are reliance upon satellites for navigation. Those are another vulnerability that needs to be protected. Also think about the broad spectrum as we look across the different domains of electronic warfare, et cetera. So again, those are areas that are important to consider for where we can use artificial enabled technologies to assist in providing the overall protection. The next is fires. The fires warfighting function are tasks and systems across all domains, against an adversary to enable operations, the future military operations. And these are, you have to remember, are both lethal and non-lethal effects from both the Army as well as for joint services and other unified action partners. And so one of the critical elements of thinking about the fire space is how do we leverage the fires themselves for their own effects, but then how do we synchronize those effects with other forms of the operations, these other functions? And the fires, again, incorporates surface-to-surface fires, air-to-surface fires, surface-to-air, cyber operations, space, multinational fires, special operations. All of those fall under this umbrella. And we've seen this played out, the importance of looking at how we can better leverage artificial intelligence in two major ways. One is the project that Army's Futures Command did called Project Convergence. And the idea is, can we take a look at the time when we identify a target to the time when we clear that target to ensure that we have distinction discrimination, that we identify the right asset to engage that target and then to fire, what we call the sensor to shooter link. That time historically has increased dramatically. And one of the ways that we're leveraging in Project Convergence is trying different systems to reduce the amount of time, right? And so in a sense, think of John Boyd's OODA loop, right? But now we're looking at in ground operations. Can we tighten the OODA loop? Can we get within an adversary's timeline to be quicker, to be more effective, and be more precise in what we do? Those of you who are following the conflict in Ukraine may have seen an article talking about a GIS art for artillery, an Uber-like app that has been developed and modified and employed in the Ukraine. And again, this is open source. I'm not coming from it from any sort of Army-specific or classified area. But it seems really intriguing, the idea that they can selectively use the call for fire, get the clearance of fires, identify the right engagement vehicle, whether it's a howitzer or a rocket or missile, and do that in an effective way, having their fires forces dispersed so that it minimizes the effect of the enemy's counter battery. I mean, it's a very interesting space that they're operating in. Again, this is not autonomous, but it's shortening that decision cycle and making those fires more precise, more effective. Another area is intelligence, right? It goes back to what Sun Tzu said about understanding the enemy, the terrain, the weather, civil considerations, other aspects of the operational environment. It's focused on the collection, right? The intelligence collection of this information. And you can imagine how just overwhelming the amount of data that is being collected. And that has to be processed and analyzed to provide real-time information. So again, that the commander, that she can see herself, that she can see how her forces are arrayed. She can visualize what the enemy is doing, how the terrain is going to affect the mission. So ways of that AI is being used, right, are multi-spectrum sensing, right? And even autonomous systems. Can we use, a combination of ground and air and other unmanned vehicles, right, to be able to provide that data that then needs to be collected, needs to be fused, needs to be sorted through. Thinking about a program we have like Artemis, right? The Airborne Reconnaissance Targeted Exportation System. the idea, again, is to allow a better picture of the battlefield and what the expectations are. And you can imagine, again, the volume of data, the ability to process that could quickly overwhelm just a sole human staff. And so you imagine that the tools that we're using to develop to assist those humans to make the better recommendations from the intelligence standpoint back to the commander so that she can make the decision in terms of the mission, which is really related to the next piece, and this is command and control. Right? Command and control is about synchronization of all the different elements of combat power, all the different functions, right? It's to assist commanders to integrating these to achieve objectives, accomplish the mission, right? I mean, and when we think about command and control, there's an element, of course, that's tied to communications. Future battlefields are going to be dirty in terms of the communications that are allowed. So part of the research is how can we push the computing power down to the edge? Because we understand that that our equipment, that our forces are going to be fighting in comms disruptive or even comms denied situations. So we're thinking about like how to develop a mesh network. How do we make it tiered? How do we make it in a sense that's self-healing? How do we make it so that you have these redundant communications, which is really an age-old concept in military command and control, right? If the radio goes out, do you have hand and arm signals? This is the AI analogous to that. But even before the battlefield, how can we leverage artificial intelligence to help with decision-making tools and the planning? Right, as a young staff officer, I remember being involved in developing courses of action for the commander and wargaming them. And at a brigade level element, even a division, you'd be fortunate if you had time to do 2, 3, maybe 5 of them, depending on how much the situation. Now, potentially, you have artificial intelligence enable systems that you can not only create multiple courses of actions, ones that may not even be considered immediately by the human staff because they're tired, right? And they're overwhelmed by the current situation. But now you can take those courses of actions and you can actually wargame. You can run them in simulation and maybe perhaps identify other options that the commander had not conceived of before. So some very powerful tools in thinking about AI-based decision-making in this space. But of course, this comes down to movement and maneuver. This is a warfighter function that moves and employs forces to position of advantage, right? Again, from the Army's perspective, where we look at our contribution is combat, is operations on land. Movement is necessary to disperse and displace the force as a whole. Maneuver directly gains or exploits positions of relative advantage. Right? Commanders use maneuver for massing effects to achieve surprise, shock, and momentum. So when we think about how movement and maneuver, we have to look at a way to now integrate those sensors and the intelligence function to the movement and maneuver function. Right? And so a program that we have as part of our project Convergence is aided threat recognition for mobile, cooperative, and autonomous sensors. We've also been in development IVAS, essentially the goggles that will provide real-time information. Again, knowing yourself, knowing the enemy and the terrain down to the lowest squad and individual soldier level. And of course, there's a lot of research in the area of autonomous vehicles. And what does that mean? Like wingman concepts. In terms of air, or the use of swarms of drones. But also think about in terms of robotics, there on the battlefield and even prior. And all these, in a sense, are working together to be able to help the commander to gain that movement and maneuver advantage. Another area, which I touched on briefly, is just think about the synthetic training environment. So even before you get to the battlefield, whether it's testing out in wargaming courses of action, or actually looking at training, pre-training, running rehearsals for a mission, or developing the skills necessary for those soldiers to be able to use and exploit those AI-enabled systems in the future, right? There's a steep learning curve, and the number of iterations that we have now, research in the area of a synthetic training environment can assist with that. Now, I believe you have a better appreciation of sort of the vast landscape where artificial intelligence can help support military operations before and during the battlefield. So now I want to talk briefly about lethal autonomy. So AI is not the same as autonomy. And I'd mention this because some people seem to conflate it. Right? Autonomy is the ability of a system to act without direction and intervention by a human, right? In the sense of this full notion, right? A human may watch or supervise, but the system, once activated, can carry out its task. Nevertheless, AI can certainly enable enhancing autonomy. And to be clear, militaries around the world are developing AI-enabled autonomous systems. But many of these systems are out there. Their intended purpose is to collect that intelligence that I mentioned. But now shifting focus on this concept of lethal autonomous weapons, right? So lethal autonomous weapons are weapons that are capable of choosing and engaging their own targets without any human input. The actions they perform can be said to have originated within the machine themselves rather than being guided from outside. So it's important to talk a bit about some of the arguments that are out there against lethal autonomy, in a sense to just be a bit clear about what those concern areas are. And so arguments range from the technologically contingent to concerns about dehumanizing war, or to making the ad bellum decision to go to war far too easy. Right? Questions like, should the decision to take a human life be relinquished to machine? And many firmly believe that it shouldn't. So I think that you can take many of the arguments and bend them in the following way. And the first area I'll discuss is system mistakes. And there are two main ways that systems may make a mistake in a lethal autonomous system. Simply put, the system may not work as designed, or the system may work as designed, but not as we intended. So first, the system may contain design or development flaws. Alternatively, the AI system may function as designed, but errors occur during deployment. Or the system may execute its tasks in unanticipated ways. For example, the system might make a mistake in identifying a target, perhaps in terms of sensor error, or the system might erroneously misclassify something or someone as a target. Also, the system might cause collateral damage from flawed calculation of expected damages. The next area that groups arguments against lethal autonomous weapons are that they're not moral agents. Laws are not agents and they can't be moral agents. So the argument goes. We may perceive the system as making a choice of targeting an individual, but it's not analogous to a human soldier's choice. Since laws are not moral agents, some argue that it would be morally wrong for these systems to kill. Further, many argue that an agent's intention matters, yet laws aren't operating from intent, they're executing code. Others likewise argue that laws have no conception of respect. They cannot respect others, enemy or civilian. The third area is this concept of the responsibility gap. What happens when laws make mistakes on the battlefield? Some argue that when deploying a lethal autonomy system, there would be no one to hold accountable if it malfunctions, commit errors, or even commits a war crime. It would be unfair in a relevant sense to blame the programmers, the engineers, the operator, maybe even the commander, since they could not have predicted how the system would act in all battlefield circumstances. The fourth area, which you see less often, is this concept of mala and se, evil in themselves. Soldiers may not use weapons or methods which are evil in themselves. For example, a weapon causing suffering or harm that is unnecessary to defeating an enemy, such as bullets poisoned to create infections that linger after a wounded soldier is taken off the battlefield, are impermissible, legally and morally. Similarly, weapons that are insufficiently discriminate or proportionate, such as biological weapons, are also banned. And these actually include a broad range of things, including mass rape campaigns, genocide or ethnic cleansing, using poison or treachery. And so some argue that certain uses of artificial intelligence might be evil in themselves and ought to be banned. But I want to return back to this question of who's responsible for laws. On the battlefield, the commander is ultimately responsible. That is one thing the military has, is this notion of command responsibility. Therefore, for legal considerations and an ethical use of an AI-enabled lethal autonomous weapons must be included in the design of these systems to ensure the commanders have the ability to make those proportionality and distinction decisions. You might wonder how commanders remain culpable in this sense. Well, here to consider the following scenario. There's a known risk associated with a lethal autonomous system employment. AI may make mistakes. The commander has weighed his or her options associated with the risk and has considered the risk worthwhile in this case. The lethal autonomous system makes a mistake. Well, then the commander is culpable for the lethal autonomous system's employment. But the question still remains, to what degree, right? And like many cases, the culpability may be very small, it may be spread, right? In fact, there may be other pieces, but it's not zero because the risk has never been zero, and the commander then chose to use it, which is why the conception of that's being raised in the military as well as in civil society is, how do we gain the trust in these systems, right? To be able to employ them. Another quick point I want to make is that 3000.09, which is the document that Secretary Carter directed in 2012, it does not ban autonomous systems, right? What it does is define autonomous and semi-autonomous systems and provides a way to have an approval process at the highest level if the military were to develop those kind of systems. But when you think about the argument categories that I've just laid out, we can even take a step further and make it a little more simplified. The ethical and legal questions around AI can be bucketed to when it works and when it doesn't work. In other words, when we think about lethal autonomous weapons, a lot of them are technologically contingent arguments. But I think what's really key to this is to separate those from, what if these weapons work exactly the way we intend? Because if you think about it, both are driven by different viewpoints about whether they be ethical to be developed and deployed. Now, the law of war is clear, right? The law of armed conflict, that the commander must use force that is, practice distinction, right? To discriminate between combatants and non-combatants, and that the force used must be proportional. But again, here's the key. In that employment, we are the ones responsible. As commanders, we are the limb fact. Now, it's my belief that these lethal autonomous systems, and the ones that we're currently underdeveloped and the ones that we'll see in the next decades, are mere amoral artifacts. They're tools. And many online may disagree with that. But if you think about it, for over 80 years, we've had autonomous systems that the military has used. They've included things like bounded search vehicles. Because really what it comes down to is a question on whether they are agents and have agency or not. If they are agents, we may not be able to code ethics. Consider the anti-codifiable thesis. We may be able to set parameters and boundaries. But if that's the case, then perhaps we'd be best to consider them as not being agents, right? So if they are mere tools, then we're the ones who establish what the boundaries are, what the parameters are, what the restrictions are. But this also presumes that we have common agreement on the ethics. And those working in this space understand that that is always up for some this conversation. Now, I personally don't think that we are currently on the path for general intelligence. Other people do. Whether we are or not, the systems that we have that are over the horizon aren't those that have general intelligence. So from my standpoint, we're not talking about lethal autonomous systems as agents. They don't have volition. They're powerful tools. But when it comes back to it, it's not saying that there shouldn't be any concern about lethal autonomous systems. I think Russell was right that we need to focus on the efforts, but not because machines are getting so smart so quickly. Rather, it's us that have rushed, potentially under-ready, often overpromise machines in a position of autonomy, not just in terms of military thinking, but across society. And we're the ones who can determine whether we're releasing these into society or not. Again, we are the limb-fact. So some of the risks and challenges. First off, AI is not a verb. People use the word artificial intelligence like, I want some of that, and why can't we just get, change this, add some artificial intelligence to it, and we'll be able to do it. Let's AI this program. Well, it's not magic. I mean, it's not its own thing. And quite frankly, most of the algorithms we're talking about today that we're actually leveraging and testing and deploying right now are stupid. They are forms of narrow AI that are leveraging a lot of the algorithms and technology that we had back in the last AI winter. But now we have access to the data. We have exponentially greater computing power, and we're working to do it because on particular problem sets, they are amazingly powerful. They are better at humans at certain tasks. So it's better to think of AI as an ecosystem of deductive, inductive, and hybrid approaches, tools for narrow data-centric environments. But of course, they're brittle. There's problems with overfitting the theory to data. There's problems of saturation, of blindness, the long tail of unintended consequences. Part of the problem when we think about those contingent technical arguments against lethal autonomy, for example, is because we don't have a clear understanding, a complete understanding of the unintended consequences for when a system fails. We don't have that autonomy of, the ontology of failure that seem to be required. Some other risk. I mentioned adversarial AI and counter AI, right? We have to understand that many of in particular, the machine learning, deep learning models are black boxes, right? And this complexity creates potential for exploitation. If a particular model is unknown to its developers, if there's an exploitation there, much like in software, right, it can be exploited, the data can be exploited. We've seen some really fascinating examples of these areas, right? I mean, adding pixels to a stop sign or on an image and having an image classifier misclassify, right? But now think about it in terms of the risk involved in dealing with potential adversary and how they might use to exploit that to their advantage. We have the problem of algorithmic bias, right? Forms of bias found in machine vision systems, object recognition models, natural language processing, word embeddings, right? Some of the bias is from the training data itself. But not all bias is bad, right? I mean, in a sense, we can imagine perhaps one day that we have a military autonomous system that's biased against civilian casualties, right? I mean, but the bias that we're talking about in terms of algorithmic bias in these areas of concern are those that we may not have a full grasp of, and what the impact is when we take that model and deploy it out into the world, right? So we have to think about, do we want this model to reflect the way the world is now or the way that we want the world to be, and adjust our data for that. Data privacy, security, who owns all this data that's out there? Who has access to it? How do we protect it from potential adversaries? What about the personnel data involved in it, right? This is not just an issue for military AI, right? You see the impacts in social media, you see and elsewhere. Insufficient T&E and V&V protocols, testing, evaluation, validation, and verification, right? The military is used to designing and developing new technology and new weapons, right? We have legal reviews capable of that. But AI is different, right? It's not just the black box that I mentioned in learning models. It's also that by definition, the model is learning, it will be different the next day. So unless you freeze it in time, right, it's going to change. And even then it's going to deteriorate as it's interacting with an environment. Furthermore, we have to think about that any military use of artificial intelligence is going to involve interactions between legacy systems and weapons, hybrid systems, those that are somehow enhanced in their processes with AI-enabled components, as well as what I call AI emergent systems, those that are developed from the ground up, right? And we're talking the next 20 years, right? I mean, as you see, and I've seen historically, you take the forces that you currently have to war, not the ones that you wish you had. Another issue is the democratization or proliferation of this technology. Much of what you see are open source code and algorithms, right? And even the data that's used. Certainly the military is looking at developing their own secure data and whatnot, but in a sense, we have to be prepared for the consequences if this technology, in a sense, is used or misused by others. We've already seen how different side of forces have leveraged cheap and new technology in Syria, in the Ukraine. How will the underregulated proliferation of AI impact warfare? How will it impact society? Additionally, the opportunity is there for an entity, a government or otherwise, that can use AI for more nefarious ends. For example, for restricting the own rights of its population. Unpredictable AI system behavior, right? It's going to behave in different ways. These are narrow AI systems that are layered. We have to think about what happens when the AI system interacts with the environment. How does that change? How does the system change the environment? What happens when AI systems interact with each other? How does the AI system affect human, the operator, the teammate, right? So immediately we might think of automation bias, right? The propensity for humans to favor suggestions from automated decision-making. But we also have to understand that the AI system may actually perform better. But it could also fail, and fail in ways that we might envision are dumb. And we might not know how to the cause of it, and may not be able to react right away. So some things to think about as I wrap up. What I'm really talking about here, whether we're talking about military artificial intelligence or artificial intelligence broadly, is that these are socio-technological issues, and they're going to require socio-technological solutions, right? Which means and comes back to involving the people. AI is a tool, it's a set of tools, right? But it may not always be the right tool. And we have to avoid the rush just to field a system, to be the first on the street, and ensure that it's in keeping with our values and the rule of law. People are the limfac. And so what does that then mean? Well, it really means, and I'll paraphrase Carl Sagan, there's a lot of baloney out there about artificial intelligence, right? And so I believe that we should have AI education for the every person, or in a military standpoint, for the every soldier, from the youngest private up to the secretary. They must be educated about the benefits, limitations, the risks of artificial intelligence, because they don't know where they're going to be in that pipeline. Even if there's somebody who controls the financial considerations, the decisions they make are going to affect the downstream. And certainly if they're going to employ this on the battlefield where the risks are so high, they must understand it fully. We also need to have productive collaboration between industry, government, and academia. The Institute is working on bringing a large conversation across the international community in this space, and I think it's absolutely critical. But it needs to be productive. We've been talking about it for years now. One of the keys to remembering this is if anyone tells you they've solved it, they have the AI ethics solution or the responsible AI solution, I'll go back to what Carl Sagan said. Everyone is wrestling with this space because everyone realized how important and how transformative this technology is going to be. We've got principles. Yes, I was very honored to be involved in developing what eventually became the US DoD's AI ethics principles. But now it's really the hard part. How do we put those principles to practice? Or as some people say, how do we operationalize them? So if we think from the US Army standpoint, right, that recognizing AI and related technologies must always be developed and used in full compliance with law and ethical considerations. And if the Army is committed, absolutely committed to ensuring that automated processes maintain appropriate levels of human judgment over the use of force. We have to keep in mind that incorporating AI has the potential to enhance our implementation of the law of war, reducing the risk of civilian casualty, other collateral damage. It can help generate and explore a course of action for the commanders that best achieve mission outcomes, minimizing risk to both deployed forces and civilians. But as it transforms the military, simultaneously it's going to transform society. And again, it's going to be up to us, the LIMFAC, on the direction that we want to head. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for your fascinating insights, and of course also for your kind words about the Institute. I will open the floor now to questions. Please submit your questions in the chat. We have already one question here. It's a bit longer. So now, no doubt that AI is effective in different areas, but in the military sector, it is still holding many risks, especially in making decisions. Systems, biases, and deviations are unavoidable yet. So it requires more research, preparations, and processes. Some attractive results could stimulate to apply AI in anticipation and protection systems. I think that there was a comment, but would you have some words about this?
No, I appreciate that the question / comment. You know, as I mentioned, and I hope came across, is the technology, the promise of it is truly transformational, and it requires really a diverse set of input. So when you think about an AI design and development team at any of large corporations or people working with the military or government, right? Do you have the broad, diverse perspectives? Are they all educated in a sense to appreciate that the decisions that they make from their specific role have an effect on the overall system? And then when you think about the risks, right? The risks, you know, especially when used on the battlefield, but even we're beginning to see the risks in other areas of sectors of society. Does the customer, in this sense, the military, the commander, do they fully understand and appreciate the risk? One way to think about it, and we talk about this with the Army AI Center, we have a conception of risk management. We have a program of it at the Army level and at the joint level. And in a way, part of that is driven from the youngest time as a non-commissioned officer or junior officer, and reinforced through the time, is you have to look at your decisions on a battlefield through risk to mission and risk to force. But I also think it's time to expand the scope of that and understand what the legal and ethical risks of are, for example, employing a system. So it's using the same mental framework that we've been trained on and educated in, but it's opening the aperture a bit so that we can take a look at identifying where there are areas of risk, what sort of risk mitigation steps ought to be in place, the testing to make sure that they are, and then finally the assessment of the residual risk, because somebody is going to be responsible for signing off on that risk and saying, yes, it's acceptable in this sort of situation. Right, and at times we've seen this, say, with nation states and their nuclear capabilities, right? That authority is held at the highest level. So, you know, even in that example, and maybe perhaps it's a dramatic one, that is a way to conceptually think about how we might incorporate risk management thinking in terms of how we design, develop, and deploy these kind of systems.
It becomes clear to me already at this point that many of the questions that you are facing and the ethical problems that you are facing are quite similar to those in other areas of AI and AI ethics, especially, I mean, one that I'm very familiar with is autonomous driving, and it can be lethal if you and can affect people who were not even involved in the original situation, and that is something that in autonomous driving is very I mean, pivotal to avoid. So okay, we have another question here. The US military has often been at the cutting edge of developing new technologies. Yes, I believe that. The question is, in the case of AI, might there be a need to work with external stakeholders in particular? And if so, and who should or is involved in the process of thinking about AI ethics as it relates to these AI tools? So how is the process? Is it the purely internal one, or are there external stakeholders involved? Of course, we are aware of the security and concerns and so on, but I think this is a key and interesting question.
No, it absolutely is. And I think the person who's asking the question is spot on, right? But when I talk about that meaningful, productive dialogue, all right, a sample of this is what we do with the Army's AI Integration Center. All right, we have an AI hub as well as an AI factory, and it's about partnering. It's about partnering with the soldiers, with the Army and their interest, but it's partnering with academia, because they're looking at what is over the horizon in terms of what it might be possible, as well as thinking about those legal and ethical considerations. And it's partnering with industry, not just those that are providing that end product, but those that are designing and building systems out to ensure that the AI-enabled technology is done in a responsible way. And then, of course, there's the governmental partners, right? For us across the different services, at the joint level of the Department of Defense, but it's also involving the government agencies. I think it's critical that also, especially in a Western liberal democracy, is that the people are involved in that conversation, right? It's part of our thinking about developing and using any technology on the battlefield, certainly in accordance with the rule of law. But it's also about the values of the people. A big part, in my belief, of the ad bellum decision to go to war and the public declaration tenet of that is not just to inform your potential adversary that you have these grievances and you're willing to go to war with them if they don't provide redress for them. It's to have that conversation with the public, to gain the public's interest and trust before you commit your forces. Now, does it all happen that way? No, probably not, but it does in various degrees. But my point is, it's the encouraging aspect of it is moving in this more collaborative way. And in a sense, the more that we have these kind of conversations will help and we'll gain the interest in each of the areas, and not just for lethal autonomy, but for these other areas of concern. And I think you're right. I think it applies to beyond just what the military and them are thinking about how we're going to use artificial intelligence.
Yeah, thank you. And another question here, someone asked, what new skills and virtues would be required of the human operators and supervisors of a cyber defense system driven by algorithms? Question of human in the loop. What skills would they need?
Well, a lot of them are fundamental skills and that ought to be trained on it. When you think about an AI-enabled cyber system as a tool, right? And so we want our operators, whether we're talking military or in the civilian world, to have an understanding, to be trained in how to employ that system, right? But also to be educated about what the risks and limitations are, so they can help them identify. Because part of that training needs to be what happens when the system fails, or when it does something that it's unexpected, and having a basic background, right, relative to their position. So again, the youngest private may not need to know all the ins and outs of the latest deep learning techniques, but they should be appreciative of these are areas where the system, because it involves some artificial intelligence enhancements to it, may potentially fail, and may potentially do things in ways that are unexpected. Some hopefully work out for the benefit, but then if the system does so, are they trained in order to take that system offline, right? So to say that I either not going to employ it in such and such situation, or if I see that it's failing in a way that I am trained in order to be able to stop it.
Yeah. How do high stress moments, such as where soldiers are operating, impact how we think about operationalizing AI ethics? I guess this is a question with regard to emotional moments. No, one of the potential benefits, and Arkin mentions this. So he said, that if we look towards an AI, a technological system, right, that could practice this critical legal component of distinction between combatant and combatant, and is not swayed when they're tired
when they're angry, or when they're just mentally exhausted. It seems to be a good thing. In fact, some have argued that perhaps we might be obligated to use a system in that way if we can ensure that we are doing our best to accomplish the mission both ethically and legally. But one of my concerns is, and I think would be shared with the listeners who's asking this question is, when we think about right now, the systems that we currently have and we're under development, there's going to be a time where we're not developing from the ground up. And by that, I mean, the AI system part of it, in a sense, is bootstrapped. And what it does potentially is causes the individual, the operator, to incur additional things to have to monitor and to be concerned about, right? In other words, the cognitive burden on that individual would increase. I think one of the key goals of how we're looking at leveraging artificial intelligence is there a way to reduce that cognitive burden, to help that soldier, that leader, that commander in those situations of high stress be able to make timely legal and ethical decisions in terms of employment of force. And I don't think that is a goal that's something that's unachievable. I think that as we work on developing these systems that become less brittle, they become more fundamental in terms of the training, doctrine, the education of how it's being employed, right? That the operator will become more familiar with and be able to practice it. I mean, the last thing we need to do is take a system like this and just give it to an individual without any prior training and thought behind it, right? And so, coming back to thinking about artificial intelligence, and whether you're talking in the corporate world or in the military world, it's really a whole of enterprise effort, right? Not just in terms of where you might leverage artificial intelligence, but you have to create an organization that can best employ it. And in this case, right, reducing the cognitive burden and allowing the operator commander to make better timely decisions is exactly the kind of thing that I think should be done.
Yeah. Well, we have a last question here, and I would like to tie this to the subject of open dialogue. That is, I think, a key concept for in all sorts of areas where AI ethics is involved, and to foster that. The question goes: does AI used in the military or lethal autonomous weapon systems need their own set of governance, or can this be integrated into overall considerations for AI governance and regulation? Final question to you.
No, it's a great question. So, in a sense, for me, I'm personally a bit torn, because I do think that so much of what we are trying to do with the AI-enabled technology is closely in line with the way that we currently envision doing business, doing our military business, and how we foresee doing it in at least the near future. But I do share some of the concerns that there are unique features of artificial intelligence that may not be wholly accountable or should be accounted for in terms of our systems and processes as they currently exist. Everything from the testing about evaluation to the validation verification piece of it, to being able to look at conceptions of explainable AI, so that we can have a better understanding of why systems are recommending the decisions or making the decisions that they seem to be doing, to just the speed of it. Again, whether your construct is using the Boyd's OODA loop or some other, part of the reason to turn to these kind of systems is their ability to process vast amounts of data and do it quickly, in a sense, faster than the human brain can function in certain spaces. And so, do we need to make adjustments to how we think about that? And this debate is continuing. There is not international agreement on whether to ban or restrict lethal autonomy. Quite frankly, some of that is because there are too many definitions of what lethal autonomy is. And the other aspect of it is basically the same concern that I raised. So much of what we do, we understand as a military, as a former U.S. Senior officer, that I need to use weapon systems. I need to employ force that is discriminate and that is proportional. And the system to be able to do that, that seems to fit that legal bill. But we don't want to belittle or to mask the concerns about the technology itself. Because again, I believe that they are contingent in many ways, but there's this fear, I think, by many in governments that if we don't develop this first, then somebody else will, and put us at a disadvantage. I think that is, I don't think that is as rational as it comes across. I think that there is competition there, but part of my concern is that we are going to field systems, and by we I mean the internationally, that aren't ready. And then, of course, then they would violate international law, the law of armed conflict. But then it kind of circles back to perhaps they shouldn't have been employed in the first place.
Thank you very much. We are almost out of time, but I wanted to take a final moment to remind you that the best way to stay up to date with our news and events is to visit IEAI's website, subscribe to our newsletter, and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. I would like to thank again David Barnes for accepting our invitation, and all of you for joining us and contributing to the discussion with your questions, comments, and remarks. So see you all in autumn and have a great summer. Thank you.
Thanks again.